Blood splattered onto the ground, mixing with the dirt and sweat beneath their feet. A boy in his 20s standing in the middle of the ring, throwing punches mercilessly at the man almost double his age. The older man was downgrading him before that match. He saw it all the way, a smug grin decorating his lips, but now the grin was nowhere to be seen. The older man stumbled, off balance, and that was all it took. The younger boy lunged forward, delivering a hard punches 1, 2, 3 straight to the man's ribs. A crack could be heard in the silence. The man let out a loud groan, bending forward in pain. Another punch landed, this time across the older man's face, his large body crumbling to the ground. Blood dripped from the boy's knuckles, but he didn't care. The crowd roared, but he didn't seem to hear it. His eyes stayed on his opponent, watching as the man struggled to rise but failed. The younger wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, stepping back as a man in a suit came forward, tossing a thick envelope of cash at his feet. The prize. The boy glanced at it, then bent down, grabbing the money and stuffing it in his pocket. "This will be 501, she said, handing the girl her plastic bag after she had bought a few things. The girl smiled, took her bag, and left the small store. YN sighed, checking the time on her phone. It was late, and she was tired. She grabbed the keys from the counter and looked around the empty store. Before leaving, she turned off the lights. She walked to the door, flipped up the sign till closed, and was about to lock it when she heard the loud roar of a motorbike engine stopping. Her hand paused on the lock. She didn't bother to turn around, thinking it was just someone passing by. "Don't close it yet. I need a few things," a deep, rough voice said from up behind her. She kept her back turned, fingers still on the lock. "The sign shows we're closed, which means I'm not opening." She turned around but froze. Her gaze immediately dropped to his knuckles, covered in blood. Blood? What the hell? "I'll pay you extra." But it wasn't the offer of money that made her heart pound. It was the blood. Was he a thief? A criminal? Or worse, a serial killer? She gripped the keys in her hand, suddenly aware of how alone she was in the small, empty shop. Her mouth felt dry as she tried to think of what to do next. His dark eyes were locked on hers, waiting for her answer. She swallowed hard but didn't move.
"YN, what happened to your hands?" That he glanced down at his knuckles, then back at her. "Nothing that concerns you." That didn't help. If anything, it made things worse. Should she let him in? Call for help? Run?
"Are you going to stare at me all night?" His rough voice, snapping her out of her frozen state. "YN, how do I know you're not some kind of criminal? You could be here to rob me or worse." He let out a short, almost amused breath, shaking his head slightly. "If I wanted to hurt you, trust me, I would have done it already." That sent a chill down her spine. She didn't know whether to be relieved or more afraid. "I just need a few things," he added, trying to reassure her without actually caring about her fear. She bit her lips, quickly glancing at his bloodied knuckles then at him. Her hand trembled as she unlocked the door without thinking. Stepped aside, and he walked in without another word. "YN, take what you need." He moved through the aisles, silently. He grabbed a few things, bandages, a bottle of water, and some painkillers, couple of energy bars. She took in his appearance. His hoodie was dark, and stained in places, not just with blood, but with dirt. She noticed his knuckles were starting to dry, the blood darkening against his skin. What kind of man shows up at a store late at night, covered in blood, with a mask on his face? A criminal. He walked over to counter and she quickly looked away. He dropped the items onto the counter. "How much?" YN quickly scanned the items. 7,001. He pulled out a crumpled bill from his pocket and tossed it on the counter. "Keep the change." She took the money, her hand brushing against his for the briefest moment. His skin felt cold. He didn't say anything, just stood there, but watching her as she bagged his things. When she handed him the bag, their eyes met again. He took the bag without a word and walked out of there. Okay, so that was rough. But her mind wondered. Who was that man? And why did he feel so familiar? "You're late today, sweetie," her mother said, looking up from the couch. "Oh, yeah. Sia left early, so I had to handle everything alone," YN replied, setting her bag down and walking over to her mom. "It's good that you can manage on your own. But don't overwork yourself. YN knelt down beside her. I won't, but how are you feeling? Your headache? I should check your blood pressure first. Come on, leave it. It's just low sometimes, high sometimes. Nothing going to happen with me. YN, Mom, you need to take care of yourself. I swear, if you don't, I'm going to hire someone to take care of you. Don't be silly. I don't need anyone fussing over me. I'm serious, she said, giving her a look. I don't want to come home and find you passed out because you didn't take care of yourself. Did you at least eat something today? Her mother smiled. I was waiting for you to come home. I thought we could eat together. She sighed, standing up and shaking her head. Mom, you should eat when you're hungry, not wait for me. I'll be late sometimes. I like eating with you. It's not the same when I'm alone. Her eyes softened. All right, let's eat together then. But from now on, don't wait too long. Promise? I promise. YN smiled back, kissing her forehead. I'll fix us something quick. You just sit tight, okay? Yeah. YN chewed on her pencil absent-mindedly, her eyes staring at the professor, but her mind was elsewhere. She stopped paying attention to the lecture ages ago. She wasn't interested in the topic at all. Honestly, she just wanted the class to be over. She opened her notebook and started making little doodles in the corner of the page. It wasn't like she was going to take any notes anyway. Her pencil moved lazily across the paper, forming random shapes. Suddenly, the classroom door opened with a loud creak. The entire room went silent, even the professor paused mid-sentence. Curiously, she looked up. Jungkook entered the room. He walked in, head down, his hoodie pulled over his head, covering most out of his face. He avoided everyone's stares, not even glancing around as he headed to the back of the room. He didn't care about the silence he caused or the fact that he was late. You're late again, Mr. John. Care to explain? Jungkook didn't respond. He didn't even look up. He just sat there, slouched in his chair, acting like he hadn't heard a word the professor said. Getting no answer, the professor seemed to give up with a sigh, continuing the lecture. Jungkook. John Jungkook. He rarely showed up to school. In the past 4 months since she transferred, she could count on one hand how many times she had seen him in class. And every time he did show up, it was like this, late, quiet, and completely uninterested. He never talked to anyone. No friends, no conversation. Just him, always alone. Whenever she saw him outside of class, he was smoking, always with a cigarette in hand, leaning against a wall, avoiding people. His dark clothes and quiet attitude gave him a reputation. Some students call him the silent bad boy, or even a ticking time bomb, but apparently, he had been in a lot of fights before. But now, he barely showed up at all, and when he did, he acted like the world didn't exist. YN didn't realize she was staring at him until he suddenly looked up. His eyes met hers. She felt like someone has freeze her in the place. But she quickly tore her eyes away. God, this is so embarrassing, she thought, ducking her head low over her notebook. She pressed her pencil back to the paper, trying to focus on her doodles. She could still feel his stare, like it was boring into her soul from across the room. She didn't dare look back. Balancing few books in one arm and a steaming cup of coffee in the other. She took a quick sip of the coffee, hoping it would keep her awake through the rest of the day. Her foot suddenly caught on something, and she stumbled forward. Books shifted in her grip, and her heart jumped, but she caught herself just in time. SH00T, she muttered, her eyes darting down to check her coffee. No spills. She let out a sigh of relief, shaking her head. Looks like today's my lucky day. But just as she turned around, she bumped hard into someone. Her body jerked back, and she felt the hot coffee splash all over her hand, her clothes, and her books. God damn it. She cursed, loudly this time. She looked down at her soaked shirt, the sticky mess already starting to drip off the edges of her textbooks. You blind bat, she began, but the words died on her tongue the moment she realized who it was. Jungkook. He stood there, towering over her. She swallowed her words for a second, but quickly regained herself. She wasn't about to back down just because it was him. Seriously? You couldn't watch where you were going? Jungkook didn't say a word. He just stared at her with that same blank look, like he couldn't care less. Then he raised an eyebrow, almost like he was waiting for her to finish. Then, without a word, he turned and started walking away, completely ignoring her outburst. That only made her angrier. Of 44H0 Lu, she grumbled under her breath, "You're lucky I didn't throw the rest of this coffee at you." To her surprise, he stopped in his tracks. She stiffened, her heart suddenly skipping a beat, and she quickly turned around, deciding to change her direction before things escalated. It wasn't that she was afraid of him. Absolutely not. But she really didn't want to start a fight right now. "YN, can you throw this dump out? It's getting too full," the manager called out. YN wiped her hands on her apron, glancing at the overstuffed bag.
"Sure," she said with a sigh. She grabbed the heavy bag. It was heavier than she expected, but she hoisted it over her shoulder, making her way out of the store. The back alley behind the building was where all the trash was dumped, dark, quiet, and always smelling faintly of garbage. Stopping in front of the dumpsters, she dropped the bag with a dull thud, but wiping her hands on her jeans, that's when she noticed a figure. He was leaning against the brick wall a few feet away, his hood pulled up, a cigarette between his lips. The faint glow of the cigarette tip burned red as he took a long drag, exhaling slowly. Smoke curled around him. It was him again. She stood there observing him for more than a minute. He didn't notice her yet or pretending. "You want it?" She froze as he lifted his head slightly, his dark eyes meeting hers through the haze of smoke. "YN, what?" He raised an eyebrow, "The cigarette. You want it?" She scoffed, "Do I look like I smoke?" He shrugged lazily, taking another drag from the cigarette. "I don't know. Maybe." She narrowed her eyes at him. "Well, I don't. I'm not into killing my lungs." "Jungkook, good for you. Do you want something then?" "YN, no. I don't." "Jungkook, looks like it. You've been standing there, staring at me for like 2 minutes. Her cheeks flushed. "I wasn't staring," she muttered, a little too quickly. A faint smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "Sure." She rolled her eyes, "You're the one out here smoking like some brooding movie villain. People are gonna look." "Jungkook, seriously?" "YN, well, you're definitely not the hero." He didn't respond, just took another drag from his cigarette, his gaze drifting away from her like the conversation was already over. But then, something caught her attention, the motorcycle parked a few feet away. Her eyes widened slightly as the memory clicked. "YN, wait, you were the one, weren't you? 2 weeks ago? Late at night, looking like a criminal with bloody knuckles." "Jungkook, what about it?" "YN, did you beat someone up that night?" "Jungkook, maybe I did." "YN, maybe? You either did or you didn't." He shrugged, flicking ash from his cigarette. "Does it matter?" "YN, yeah, it kind of does. You can't just walk around like some mystery thug with blood over you and act like it's no big deal." He took one last drag before tossing the cigarette on the ground, crushing it under his boot. "Jungkook, I can." He took a step toward her, entering in her personal space. "You scared?" She tried really hard not to take a step back. "I'm not." He leaned in just enough so that their faces were inches apart, the heat of his breath brushing against her skin. "Good." Then he exhaled the rest of the cigarette smoke right into her face. The haze of smoke surrounded her, the bitter scent filling her lungs. She blinked, her throat tightening as she tried not to cough. "Next time, mind your own business." He gave her one last look, before turning on his heel and heading toward his bike. She watched him climbing onto his bike as he sped off into the night. What a jerk.
Or at least, she thought he was a jerk. Almost 3 weeks later, she saw him again. It was near closing time, the store was nearly empty. As soon as he walked in, YN knew it was him. Even with the hoodie pulled up and a mask covering half of his face, she could tell. He was almost limping as he grabbed a few items from the shelves. When he reached the counter, she noticed the fresh cut on his eyebrow, the same redness and swelling on his knuckles as before. He placed his things on the counter, not saying a word, his eyes avoiding hers. YN stared at him for a moment, her hands moving automatically to scan the items. He wasn't even trying to hide that something happened. He wore the mask like it would stop her from noticing the obvious bruises on his face, but she could see through it. Was he in another fight? She wanted to ask, but she remembered his words. "Next time, mind your own business." She handed him the plastic bag, and he took it without a word and walked away. Why do I feel like following him? She thought. He's right. No matter how curious I am, I don't want to get involved in whatever that shady stuff he's into. She sighed, shaking her head as she turned off the lights and grabbed the keys. It was late, and she just wanted to go home. After locking up the store, she stuffed the keys into her pocket and turned to leave. Suddenly she felt a sharp yank at her hair, her head snapping back as a rough hand gripped her waist, pulling her into the shadows. What the hey, she gasped, her heart pounding in her chest as she struggled to free herself. Let go of me. But the grip tightened, and she could feel his hands searching her pockets, her shirt, then moving down her pants as he cursed under his breath. Give me your damn money. Okay. Take it, just let go of me. She managed to pull out a few bills, her fingers shaking as she held them out. Here, just take it. It was better just give him money. It was better than he shoot her or worse. The area is almost empty. The man snatched the money out of her hand, but to her horror, he didn't let go of her. His grip tightened around her waist, his hands wandering back up her body, pressing harder against her. No. Let me go, I gave you money, she shouted in panic. He didn't listen, his hands still roaming, still gripping. Do something. Now. She turned her head and bit down, hard, on the arm closest to her. The man yelped in pain, loosening his grip for just a second, but it was enough. She twisted out of his grasp, kicking him straight in his stomach. B1T6H, he spat, clutching his arm where her teeth sunk in. She didn't wait for what he'd do next. She turned and ran, not stopping to look back. Her pulse raced in her ears, drowning out everything but the sound of her footsteps. The cold air burned in her lungs as she ran, but no matter how fast she went, she could hear the footsteps behind her, getting closer. He's still following me. Man and their goddamn ego. She stumbled on something, but she quickly caught herself. She could barely think. Her only goal was to get away, anywhere but here. Suddenly, two strong arms wrapped around her, yanking her off the street and into a dark alley. She gasped, trying to scream, but the sound was cut off by a rough hand clamping down over her mouth. Her heart pounded wildly, her breath coming out in panicked bursts as she struggled to free herself. Get off, she tried to shout, but it came out muffled beneath the man's hand. She kicked and twisted in his grip. Keep quiet. It's me. She heard a low whisper in her ear. The hand loosened, and she opened her eyes, blinking rapidly. Her heart was still hammering in her chest, but this time when she looked up, her gaze locked with familiar dark eyes. And did his words supposed to calm her down? If anything, her heart raced even faster. His arms were still around her, one hand at her waist pinning her to him, his body close enough that she could feel the heat from him. She swallowed hard. It wasn't the cold eyes she was used to seeing in him. Yet his expression didn't give away anything. His eyes were scanning her all over, from her wide eyes, to her cheeks, to the curve of her lips, and back up again, as if searching for something. She couldn't tell what. The alley was dead quiet now, except for her heavy breathing. The footsteps of whoever attacked her faded, but he still hadn't let go. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her mind screaming at her to move, to say something, anything, but she couldn't. She was frozen in place, pinned not just by his arms, but by the weight of his stare. His face was close enough that she could see every small detail, the fresh cut on his eyebrow, the sharp lines of his jaw hidden under his hood. He was so close, closer than anyone ever been to her. Her breathing grew shallow, but her mind refused to calm down. Did he think this was supposed to relax her? You. She started, but her voice came out hoarse. She swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. Was she supposed to thank him? Be mad at him? You scared the hell out of me. He raised an eyebrow. I saved your life, he said, stepping back a little, finally giving her some space. She let out a shaky breath. Yeah, well. Should I thank you? He had a gun, you know. So you should. Jungkook scoffed, clearly not in the mood to argue. Well, in this area, you're not gonna find a gentleman. They're all BL00DY sick. She bit her lip in thought. She knew this neighborhood wasn't the safest, and she hated it with all her might. She glanced at him. You live around here too? He ignored her as he bent down, picking up a jacket she hadn't noticed before. When he straightened up, she saw it, the bandages around his knuckles which was now falling. Was he cleaning his wounds back here? He is doing this alone, patching at himself up like a routine, no one around to help him. You should probably get that looked at. Jungkook glanced where she was pointing. It's nothing. Should I help you? She doesn't know why she even offered it. No, he turned down the offer flatly. Of course, he'd say no. He wasn't exactly the type to let anyone help him. He walked towards his bike and settled on it. Are you going to just let me stand here? She didn't want to sound desperate, but damn it, she was still rattled, and she just wanted to get home. To feel safe again. I mean, she added quickly, I'd really like to get home in one piece, but preferably. Jungkook raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching slightly as if he found her plea amusing. Do I look like a driver to you? She rolled her eyes, yet her heart was still hammering in her chest. No. But you could at least pretend to be a gentleman and offer to drop me off. You know, considering you just saved my life and all. Jungkook let out a soft scoff, his eyes narrowing slightly as if the idea of being a gentleman was laughable to him. I'm not a gentleman. I already know that. But nothing wrong in trying? She gave him a pointed look. He stood there for a moment, his gaze still locked on her. She almost thought maybe he would soften, maybe he would offer. But he started the engine. Stay out of trouble. She let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. Yeah. Thanks for the ride, she muttered sarcastically under her breath. She knew he wasn't listening anymore. She took a shaky step back, watching him speed off into the night, leaving her standing there alone. YN swore she wasn't stalking Jungkook. But lately, it seemed like he was everywhere she went. No matter what time of day, or which corner of the campus or street she turned, there he was. It was getting weird. Too weird. Maybe he was the one following her. But that didn't make sense either. Why would he? That he barely acknowledged her existence unless it was to throw a snarky comment or glare in her direction. And yet, here they were, crossing paths again and again. It had to be a coincidence, right? But now, sitting in the middle of a packed underground fighting ring, she was starting to question everything. This place, loud, sweaty, and smelling like a mix of alcohol and cheap cologne, was the last place she expected to see him. It was illegal, well-known place in this area. The area where she shifted 4 months ago is illegal, but it was cheap. She and her mother had no choice. There was no real connection between her and this place. She hated it. She would have never set foot here if it wasn't for her best friend, who somehow always managed to drag her into the most uncomfortable situations. Julia begged her to come tonight, saying her boyfriend was fighting, and that she couldn't miss it. YN had tried to refuse, but her friend never took no for an answer, so here she was, sitting in the stuffy crowd, her hands tightly clamped together, feeling annoyed. Money, fans, alcohol, cheers, sweat, blood, everything was getting on her nerves. It was loud, too loud. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and booze, making her wrinkle her nose in disgust, and she tried not to gag. Julia's boyfriend just won the match and everyone was cheering. She was just about to tell her friend she wanted to leave when something, or rather, someone, caught her eye. Jungkook. What the hell was he doing here? But then she noticed something that made her freeze. He was shirtless, gloves on his hands, getting ready to step into the ring, of course. Of course he would be here, this guy always seemed to show up in the most questionable places, and somehow it didn't surprise her. He was involved in every shady thing. It was almost a joke at this point. Was there anything illegal or dangerous that he wasn't part of? But still, seeing him like this, about to step into the ring, made her stomach twist. His body, lean but muscular, was covered in tattoos she never noticed, but he looked dangerous. Then the fight began. Apparently everyone know Jungkook here, they all were making bet on him, and then the fight began. Jungkook moved fast, throwing punches. His opponent was no weakling either, but Jungkook barely flinched. His fists connected with the man's jaw, sending him back, but not before the other guy managed to land 2 or 3 hard hits to Jungkook's stomach. She placed her own hand on her stomach. That must have hurt. It was brutal, almost hard to watch, but somehow, she couldn't look away. Every punch Jungkook threw was merciless, and before long, his opponent was on the ground, unable to stand. The ref called the match, and the crowd erupted in cheers again, but Jungkook didn't even seem fazed. He won. Jungkook won the match. Her throat felt dry as she watched him calmly take the money he'd earned, stuffing it into his pocket like it was just another day in his life. And then he was walking out. YN stood up and decided to follow him, keeping her distance. She knew she shouldn't have, knew that every step closer was a bad idea. God, I really need to stop this, she thought, biting her lip. But before she could debate further with herself in her mind, Jungkook suddenly stopped in his tracks. He turned around abruptly, his sharp gaze locking onto hers. She froze, caught like a deer in headlights. Jungkook, what the hell are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing, she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. What are you doing here? Fighting in some underground ring? His eyes narrowed as he took a step closer. I don't owe you any explanations, his tone flat. Now, why the hell are you following me? I wasn't following you. YN snapped, it was a lie, not entirely, I just ended up here. He scoffed, clearly not buying her excuse. You just ended up in an underground fight club? Her cheeks flushed. I was with a friend, okay? Not that it's any of your business. Jungkook scoffed and turned, walking away without another word. Her legs moved on their own, following him like a magnet. What am I doing? He reached his bike, parked just outside the club. He suddenly looked up, eyes locking with hers. Climb up. She blinked, taken aback. What? You heard me, he said, throwing his leg over the bike and settling into the seat. Climb up. YN, why would I do that? He didn't even blink. You followed me all the way here. Might as well finish with the ride. Her cheeks flushed again. I wasn't following you. This is so stupid. He raised an eyebrow, a mocking smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Sure you weren't. YN, I wasn't. Jungkook, make up your mind. I don't have much time. She felt her phone buzz in her pocket and pulled it out, seeing a message from her friend. Where the hell are you? She glanced back up at Jungkook, who was still staring at her with that unreadable expression. Part of her wanted to turn back, go find her friend, and pretend this whole thing never happened. But another part of her, the same reckless, curious part that kept leading her toward Jungkook, felt drawn to him. She hesitated, glancing between him and her phone. YN, look. I can't just leave. I came here with someone. Jungkook raised an eyebrow. So? Tell them you're leaving. Or stay. Doesn't matter to me. She narrowed her eyes at him. He didn't seem to care either way, but there was something in the way he looked at her that made her feel like he was testing her, waiting to see what she'd do next. With a sigh, she quickly typed a message to her friend. I'm leaving. Don't wait for me. She pressed send before she could change her mind. She walked over to him. He was watching her. Changed your mind? YN, where are we going? He let out a breath, almost like a laugh. You ask too many questions. YN, I'm not just going to get on without knowing where we're going. Jungkook, I won't harm you. You should know by now. So trust me, wherever we are going you will like it. She was taken aback the shift in his tone. YN, you would be the last person I want to trust. That was lie, a part of her already trust me. Call her foolish, call her reckless, but after living in danger for so long, she started to like the thrill of it. Last chance, he said, showing her the helmet. She let out a shaky breath and accept it. She slipped the helmet on. His hand curled around her wrist, tugging her closer. Her heart jumped as his fingers brushed the side of her face, locking the helmet in place with a click. The pressure made her lips puckered slightly, her cheeks squished, and she saw him visibly gulp, though his expression remained neutral. Just for a second she was damn sure he took a quick glance at her lips before he looked away. Why is he so damn confusing? She quickly pushed the thought aside and climbed onto the bike behind him, her hands barely gripping the sides of the seat. Hold on tight. No, I'm fine. I'll be okay. He glanced back over his shoulder, eyebrow raised. You sure? Yeah, I'm sure. Without warning he sped up the bike. A scream nearly slipped out of her throat, her hands flying to wrap around his waist. Her body pressed tightly against his back. A curse was on tip of her tongue and she felt the vibration of his chuckled up beneath her grip, but she refused to admit how safe it actually felt to be holding onto him like this. YN closed her eyes, letting herself enjoy the breath. For the first time in years she felt like she could breathe. The air didn't feel toxic, and night was quiet just how she loved. She could stay here forever, away from everything else. You're enjoying this a little too much. She didn't open her eyes, as he settled beside her. The smell of cigarette smoke reached her. I am. Jungkook, feels free? Slowly she opened her eyes, blinking as SBE as she turned her head to look at Jungkook. He was sitting there, leaning back, one hand resting on his knee while the other held his cigarette. Yn, I feel lighter. Like the weight of everything is gone, just for now. Do you ever feel like that? He flicked the ash off the tip of his cigarette, watching it fall before speaking. Sometimes. But it never lasts. He offered her the cigarette again, holding it between his fingers. She raised her eyebrow at him. He scoffed, leaning back a little, boring. The next moment she snatched the cigarette right out of his hand. He looked at her, maybe a little surprised, though he didn't let it show as she brought the cigarette to her lips. She took a small inhale. The burn hit her throat immediately, and she was coughing hard, her eyes watering. Jungkook chuckled under his breath, watching her struggle. First time. No, she croaked between coughs, just not used to it. It's been a while. He smirked, clearly not buying her lie. Yeah, sure. You're a natural. She shot him a glare, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. Shut up. He leaned back a bit, raising an eyebrow. Really? So, when was the last time you smoked? Yn paused, thinking back. Probably 2 or 3 years ago. My dad used to smoke a lot, and me being curious, I wanted to try it too. Thought it'd make me look cool or something. He glanced at her, and? Did it? She let out a small, dry laugh. No. I ended up coughing just like this. My dad caught me, though, and freaked out. Took the cigarette out of my hand, beat me and told me I was too young for that shit. His smirk faded at her words, his eyes narrowing. He beat you for it? She shrugged, trying to brush it off. Yeah, well, he wasn't exactly the gentle type. She laughed. I guess he thought that was the best way to teach me a lesson. Jungkook stayed quiet for a moment, his jaw tightening as he looked away. Some people shouldn't be parents. She looked at him, something told her that he know that feeling. You sound like you know something about that. His gaze fixed on the ground. Let's just say I get it. Yn wanted to ask more, but she know he won't answer her. Jungkook, before you transferred here. Where do you used to live? That question did caught her off guard. She wasn't sure she should share. Yn, I Taegu. I grew up there. Jungkook, why'd you leave? What made you come to live in this hellhole? Yn, let's just say not one thing. A lot of them which forced me to shift here. And I wanted to start new. He nodded, waiting for her to continue, but she left it at that. There was no need to go into all the details, few things she will left it at that. Jungkook, was it that bad? That you had to leave everything behind? She let out a dry chuckle. You'd be surprised if I told you. So let's not go there. He didn't push and she was glad. She gulped and took the cigarette from him, this time managing to inhale without choking. He stared at her, his eyes shifting between her face and her hand. His fingers twitched slightly, itching to reach out and hold hers. A little feeling that he made a mistake asking about her past. Jungkook, want to go? She exhaled slowly. Yeah, I guess so. Mom must be worried. He gave her a nod, standing up and putting out the cigarette beneath his boot, waiting for her to follow him. When they reached Yn's house, she finally unwrapped her arms from around him, her hands letting go of his firm waist. The moment her feet touched the ground, she already missed the warmth of his body. She is definitely put of her mind. Jungkook stayed seated, watching her as she removed the helmet and ran her fingers through her hair, trying to fix the mess the ride caused. She handed the helmet back to him, her fingers brushing his. Yn, thank you. Jungkook, for what? For tonight, she said, feeling her heart quicken. Jungkook, I didn't do anything. Still. Jungkook, don't get used to it though. A small smile formed on her lips. It came out more of a smirk, because she really wanted to get used to it. Was it wrong? To get to know him better, Yn, what if I want to? What will you do? But Jungkook, you shouldn't get involved with me. It's dangerous. YN, well, maybe I like a little danger. She took a step back, but his finger clasped around her wrist pulling her back to him. Her heart was pounding, but she couldn't look away from him. The space between them seemed to shrink with every breath. Her mind screamed to pull back, to create some distance, but her body betrayed her, staying rooted in place. She could see the way his eyes flickered to her lips for just a second before meeting her gaze again. She thought he would pull back, but the moment the thought crossed her mind his L1PS crashed on hers. His hand found the back of her neck, pulling her closer, and she let herself melt into it, her hands gripping the front of his jacket. It was messy and intense, like neither of them had time to think, just act. The second she K1 set him back, it was like everything else disappeared. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathless, and Jungkook's hand lingered at the side of her neck, his thumb brushing her skin. His eyes were darker, stared into hers, as if waiting for her to say something. But when she didn't, he knew one thing, he just found his new addiction. Or more like his damn weakness.